saying. My name is Stuart Perry. I'm a master of social work as well as a certified social worker with a little over 15 years in the children's mental health field. And I've worked with children for basically my whole life, a little over 20 years now, working with children. So I love coming on and being able to talk with people about all sorts of different things, but especially children's mental health. And today we're going to talk about anxiety, which is one of those things that everyone will face at a certain time. And then also I have with me here, let me point down for Instagram and Facebook. This is Stark. Stark is actually a dog who is trained for panic disorder. And he's trained to help people calm down. So he's amazing. He might be popping in and out as we talk today. But let's talk about anxiety. Anxiety is one of those tough emotions that everyone will face at a certain point. Sadness, fear, anger, anxiety, all those are some tough things that everyone will face. And so the question kind of comes up of, okay, if everyone's going to have anxiety, why is it that anxiety is a disorder? And the simple answer to that is that anxiety is not a disorder. Anxiety in and of itself is a completely normal thing that everyone will face at some point in their life. Feeling anxious is not a problem. Having anxiety is the problem. There is a difference between feeling anxious and being anxious. Let me say that again. There is a difference between feeling anxious and being anxious. Feeling anxious just means that you are feeling that normal feeling. Being anxious means that anxiety has now become your default mode. Let's think of it like this. Maybe you've seen the movie Inside Out, the Pixar movie. It's amazing. If you haven't seen it yet, you should watch it. And there's another one coming out, supposedly, here in the next year or so. But in that movie, there's all sorts of emotions in this little girl's brain. But joy is the emotion that has the button that controls the little girl. What that means is that there's all these emotions that get to give input to joy. There's a lot of different emotions that can provide insight to different things. But joy is the one that gets to push this button and control this girl. Joy has the final say. Joy is the default mode of the girl in the story. Well, having anxiety or being anxious, not just feeling anxious, but having anxiety or being anxious is like as if that button was being pushed by anxiety. So joy is no longer the default mode. Now anxiety is the default mode. Anxiety is getting to make choices for you. For instance, you may be anxious if you are out in public, especially with COVID-19, the pandemic, all sorts of other things going on. You may feel anxious while you're out in public. However, if while you're out in public, you start to feel anxious, and then because of that anxious feeling, you decide that you can no longer go back out in public, now you have anxiety and you are being anxious, not just feeling anxious. If you are feeling anxious, you are responding to an emotion. If you are being anxious, now anxiety has become your default mode. That is the difference between feeling anxiety and having an anxiety disorder. We will all feel anxious at some point in our lives, but will you allow that anxiety to make decisions for you? Will you allow it to decide what things you can or cannot participate in? If so, if anxiety is pushing your button, if anxiety is the one that is making the decisions, then it may be that you have an anxiety disorder. You may not just be feeling anxious. Let's talk for just a second about what's going on in the brain when anxiety peaks its little head. What's happening is there's a little piece in the brain called the amygdala. Now, if you don't know about the amygdala, that's okay. I did another Facebook Live not long ago that was all about tantrums. And in that Facebook Live, I discussed different pieces of the brain, and the amygdala is one of the pieces that I discussed. The amygdala is kind of like the body's smoke detector. And if you'd like to know more about it, you can check out the Facebook Live that I did about tantrums. You can see that on the MisterStuTV YouTube page, as well as at MisterStuTV.com. That's MisterStuTV.com. You can check it out there. And that amygdala, like I said, it's like the body's smoke detector. It will go off if there's something going on that the body needs to respond to, that there's some sort of danger that's happening. But what can happen over time is that amygdala can start to go off even when there's not danger and tell your body to respond to something even when there's nothing for the body to be responding to. When that happens, the body becomes kind of in this default mode of always being on edge, of believing that something bad is on the horizon, that there's something to be on the lookout for, even when that's not actually the case. That's what can happen when you are being anxious or having anxiety or having an anxiety disorder, not just feeling anxious. That amygdala is going off and saying, hey, there's something to prepare for, there's something that's dangerous, there's something that will hurt you, you need to respond to this, and that may or may not be the case. That amygdala has now been trained to say that something is dangerous even though it's not. And when that happens, your body becomes in this kind of panic mode about there's always something that's about to pop out. Imagine that you're watching a horror movie and the music is dun 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 dun, and you know that something's about to happen. That's kind of that feeling that anxiety will give you. And if you are feeling that just every once in a while, then that's completely normal. That's a completely normal thing to feel anxious. But if most of the time, or even in situations where it doesn't really make sense, you're feeling that donna, 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 donna feeling, then it may be that you have an anxiety disorder, or that you are being anxious, not just feeling anxious. Let's talk about some of the common signs and symptoms, especially as they present themselves in children. And you may be surprised at some of these things. The first three might actually have you thinking about something else. If a child is restless, meaning that it doesn't seem like they can just sit still, or it doesn't seem like they can turn off in their mind, that restlessness. If they are fidgety, meaning that they can't stop moving. It's not just mental now. Now their body is actually responding and they can't seem to stop clicking a pen a bunch of times or needing to squeeze something or tapping, different things like that. If that's going on, or if they're having difficulty focusing, especially if that's not normal for them. Restlessness, fidgety, difficulty focusing, a lot of people would say that that is ADHD. Well, those are common signs and symptoms that a child is going through anxiety, especially if that restlessness, that fidgetiness, and that difficulty focusing happen in one environment much more than another environment. Or if all of this just kind of comes out of nowhere. Maybe the child used to be very well regulated. They used to be able to sit there. It used to seem like they could shut down, slow down, turn their mind off. And now that's not happening. Then it could be that the child is facing an anxiety disorder, not ADHD. Most of the time when people hear that restlessness, fidgety, difficulty focusing, their default answer is, my child must have ADHD and they need ADHD meds. Well, imagine what can happen if a child is misdiagnosed. If they are diagnosed with ADHD and given a medication that helps with ADHD, but really they've got anxiety. What's going on is that medication that they would be prescribed for ADHD would make the brain hyper focus and be able to, it would stimulate the brain into more thought. So now that child is restless, fidgety, with difficulty focusing, and their brain is only hyper focused on the thing that they are fearful of. That's what can happen if a child is diagnosed with ADHD when really they're facing an anxiety disorder. So that restlessness, being super fidgety, a difficulty focusing, especially if those things are new. If a child is overly emotional and or reactive, and I say overly emotional because every child is a little bit different, but if it seems like tiny little things are setting the child off, and especially if that causes them to become tearful, if they are tearing up or becoming sad much more often than normal, then that can be a sign that they are facing an anxiety disorder. And the reason for that is because if they're always on this tension, what that means is that there's a lot that's already built up inside of them. There's a lot that's going on that is already uncomfortable, and one little thing just pushes them over the edge often. Imagine if your brain is kind of on that mode of thinking, donna, 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 there's something coming to you now, it's going to harm you really bad. If your brain is always right there and then a little thing happens, that could send you all the way over the edge and cause you to react in big ways, whether that be violent and aggressive tantrums, or whether it be tearing up often, or whether it's just a big explosive verbal reaction. And especially if that is something that is out of context most of the time for the child. If a child is often sick, especially with headaches or stomach aches. Now, it could be that they need to go and see their pediatrician. So make sure that you get that checked out as well. But if a child is just often sick, and especially if it's about going to a certain environment, whether that be going to school or being away from their parent or being out in social situations, if that causes their stomach to start feeling like it's spinning and for their head to start hurting, then that could be a sign or a symptom of an anxiety disorder. The reason for that is that we actually have 3 different brains in our body. There's the main brain that's in our head, and that's the brain organ. There's an organ there. But there's actually 2 other bundles of neurons that are connected to the brain that are both surrounding our heart, and then there's another one that's surrounding our intestines. So when those neurons are all talking to each other, that's what can make your heart start to beat much faster, and that's what can create that spiraling, spinning feeling in your intestines, because your organ brain is telling your heart brain and your gut brain to get ready for an attack. So you need to burn some fuel, you need to digest something, because you need to be able to either run away or fight that thing. Your heart needs to speed up because you need to be able to either run away or fight that thing in fight or flight mode. So if a child is having a lot of headaches or stomach aches, that can be a sign or symptom of an anxiety disorder. So restlessness, fidgetiness, difficulty focusing, overly emotional and or reactive, tearful, or if they are often sick with headaches or stomach aches. And again, notice changes in the child. If these are new things for the child and maybe they're going through something in their life, then this could be a sign or a symptom of an anxiety disorder. Let's talk about a few common types of anxiety disorders. The first one, the one that I see the most, I deal mainly with small children in my practice. So elementary school age and younger is mainly what I work with. One of the main types is called separation anxiety. Separation anxiety is just that fear of being away from your primary caregiver, whether that be a mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, whether it be an adoptive parent, a foster parent, whether it be just someone who takes care of you the most. If the child has the most difficulty or shows the most signs or symptoms when they are away from a primary caregiver, then it could be that what they're dealing with is called separation anxiety. And that separation anxiety is a fear about two different things. One is the fear that that caregiver is not going to come back. So I can see this type of anxiety a lot in children who have been bounced from placement to placement or who had some volatile situations in their home settings that cause them to feel like maybe once a caregiver leaves one time, they won't be returning. That's one reason for that separation anxiety. And then the other thought is that something will happen to that caregiver when they are separated. This happens a lot with children whose parents have medical issues or whose parents, if they've lost a parent, that separation anxiety can be really big. Or if they've lost someone else that they were close to, then it could be that they put that fear that they're also going to lose their primary caregiver. That separation anxiety can be really difficult for a child. And again, it's that time, anytime they're away from a primary caregiver, if you see some behaviors start to escalate, if you see that they are more emotional, more restless, difficulty focusing, more fidgety, maybe they are more emotional, reactive, maybe they start to feel more sick, then it could be that they're dealing with some separation anxiety. The next type I want to talk about is what's called panic disorder. And that's what I told you Stark is trained for. Stark is my 130-pound German Shepherd. He is amazing. And panic disorder is actually something that I deal with. I have obsessive compulsive disorder, and we'll talk about that one in just a minute. Obsessive compulsive disorder with panic. And panic disorder is the feeling that your body gets if your brain is signaling that there's something to be anxious about, that your body's reaction, so really a whole lot of that heart beating, a lot of the stomach turning, headaches. It can also feel as if you are going to have a heart attack or a stroke, or you are going to die in some way that is out of your control. That it kind of feels like this out-of-body experience. That's what a panic attack feels like. And panic disorder is that disorder where panic attacks come on fairly often. So panic disorder is that anxiety feeling, that reaction in the body. It can happen a lot with those children or those people who have faced trauma in their life. So their body has a natural reaction to either want to fight, flight, freeze, appease, or collapse. And so the body's reaction to anxiety is there. It could be that maybe they were in a situation before where they could not get out of that situation. And so because of that, their body is now trained that when they start to feel anxious, that they will then be anxious. And because they are now being anxious, their body feels like it has to collapse, or their body feels like it's not going to be able to take care of itself in some way. That's panic disorder. The next one would be social anxiety disorder. That's one where it's a fear of crowds or being out in public places. This is one that as clinicians we see a lot right now, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic. With all sorts of violence going on, we see a lot of social anxiety disorders. This means that the person's brain has been trained that when they are out in public, when they are in a group, that something bad could happen. This one can come from trauma. It can also come from an overconsumption of news that tells them that the public is very dangerous. It could be also that they were in a situation before where they couldn't get out of that situation, and so they felt either overly embarrassed and that something was going to happen to them because of that embarrassment, or it could be that they are fearful that something dangerous is going to happen in social situations. Again, it's that hypersensitivity to those social situations. everyone may have a little bit of social anxiety when they go out and they're around a giant group of people and there's unpredictable amounts of alcohol consumption or people running all around and they're not quite sure what's going on. At a sports event, maybe social anxiety can run high. But if you are able to participate in the event, you're able to make it all the way through, it's likely that you don't have social anxiety disorder. However, if you start to feel that panic and there's nothing actually happening, but it feels like you need to leave and then you do actually leave, it could be that you are suffering from social anxiety disorder. It's that feeling that you're going to be trapped in a social situation and not be able to make it out. The next one is what's called OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. This is one that has a lot of misconceptions surrounding it. A lot of people think that this is the clean disorder, that, oh my gosh, I'm just so OCD because I love things clean and organized and straightened. And I got to tell you, if you like things clean and organized and straightened, that is not a disorder. There's no problem there. Obsessive compulsive disorder is an obsession followed by a compulsion that causes a disorder. Let me break it down. An obsession, some thought or image enters your mind that someone is going, maybe it's that someone is going to be hurt, or that something is out of place. And because something is out of place, something bad is going to happen. And you can't seem to shake this thought out of your mind. You obsess over that thought. And it usually comes down to something that's fairly trivial, like maybe a lock that you've checked is still not locked. That's the thought that would be in your head. You've checked the lock, you know you've checked the lock, you've told yourself you've checked the lock, but you still have convinced yourself that you did not check that lock. And because you didn't check the lock, your house is going to get broken into and everything's going to get stolen and everything you love is going to be destroyed. So that's that obsession. It's not, oh, I like things clean and organized. It could be, as Mark Summers once figured out, that if your rug, if the corner of a rug is turned up, that you can't fall asleep at night because you think that in the morning you're going to trip and fall and die over the corner of that rug. So that is the obsession. It's not, things are just so messy, I want them more clean. It's this obsessive thought that typically leads to huge injury or death. This obsessive thought in your mind. Then the disorder part comes because of that thought in your mind. You feel you have to do something. So the lock isn't locked. So I have to go touch the lock 5 times. Once I've touched the lock 5 times, now I know it's locked. And I had to get up out of bed to go touch the lock 5 times, or I had to turn the car around and go touch the lock 5 times, or I had to get up out of bed and fix the rug, the corner of the rug. It's that compulsion. So it's an obsessive thought, an obsession followed by a compulsion, a behavior that you feel you don't have any control over, or a behavior that you feel you have to do to get rid of that obsession. So obsessive compulsive disorder, and that's the final part. That disorder means that it has to cause some kind of problem. Maybe these routines of obsessing and then the compulsions that follow those obsessions are causing you to be late to work or school. That would be a disorder because it's causing things in your life to be out of order. So obsessive compulsive disorder is another type of anxiety. Then there is what's called a specific phobia. This is just a fear about a specific thing, or anxiety surrounding a specific thing. It could be spiders, it could be heights, it could be snakes, it could be clowns, it could be jello, it could be rough textures, it could be certain sounds. Specific phobias go on and on and on. There is nothing that cannot be a specific phobia. If someone just, I had a friend in college who had a specific phobia regarding peanut butter. They just could not be near peanut butter, and their body actually caused a their heart to race, and they would become sweaty. And it wasn't an allergy to peanut butter. They could consume peanut butter. They didn't, but they could have consumed peanut butter. There was an actual fear and anxiety about being trapped in the peanut butter and that their mouth would get stuck shut. So that was a specific phobia. A specific phobia can be about anything. And again, it's just your brain going off and telling you that something is dangerous when it's probably not. Now, spiders and snakes, heights, those are all things to have a fearful reverence for. But again, if it's, hey, I cannot go on a hike because I might see a spider and that spider will come and kill me, well, now you're facing a disorder. And then the final type is what's called generalized anxiety disorder. That basically just means that your brain is constantly in a default mode that something is about to happen. It's a constant fear response, and it's a lot of just constantly on edge, constantly feeling like something's going to come out and happen. That's that generalized anxiety disorder. There are others, but those are the most common types that we see as clinicians. Let's talk about some support for anxiety disorders, especially with children. The first is just to normalize the emotion of anxiety. Like I said, anxiety is something that everyone will face and everyone will feel at some point in their life. But having anxiety or having an anxiety disorder is different, and being anxious is different. But to normalize that emotion of anxiety, to normalize it and say, you know, everybody feels this way at times, can be very helpful. And to name it, not just to say, oh, everybody feels that way sometimes, but to really have the conversation. It sounds like what you're feeling is anxiety. Anxiety is that feeling that it seems like something is about to happen, that something bad is about to happen. Is that how you're feeling? Oh, yeah, everybody feels that way sometimes, and it can be a really tough way to feel. Now you've completely normalized it. You've said there is a name for this. I have felt it before. Other people have felt it before, and they've made it through this. Normalize that emotion of anxiety. Then exposure over time to that anxiety. Now, depending on how intense the anxiety is, you may or may not be able to do exposure and actually expose the person to the anxiety. And there are certain times where it's not safe to expose the person to the anxiety. Stark and I are trained to do exposure therapy for dogs. If a person has had a difficult interaction with a dog and they have a specific phobia about dogs, then Stark and I are actually trained to be able to help the person overcome that specific phobia towards dogs by doing exposure. So over time, they're able to see Stark, then they can move closer to Stark, they can start to pet Stark, and then they can actually allow Stark to interact with them. With separation anxiety, it could be, hey, I'm going to go take a phone call in the other room. It's going to take me 5-10 minutes, and then I'll be back, and I'll be back to check on you. During that time, you cannot come in and check on me. And so that's the 5 to 10 minutes. Then you can move it to 30 minutes. Then it's, hey, I'm going out to dinner, and I'll be back in a couple hours. I'll check in halfway through, something like that. But it's that built up of exposure over time. For OCD, you can also do some exposures where it's like, oh, okay, you feel like you didn't check the lock. You know what? Rather than checking the lock right now, let's wait 5 minutes. We're going to wait 5 minutes before you go and check the lock. And then you're free to go check the lock. But over that 5 minutes, I want you to sit with that feeling of anxiety and understand that it's okay to feel that way, and I'll be right here. So exposure over time. So you want to normalize the emotion, and then if it's safe, you want to expose the person to what it is that they are anxious about over time, and make sure you're checking in with them so that they're not going into something that is too intense. Exposure therapy is something that you do need to be trained to do. So exposing someone and exposure therapy are two different things. Exposing someone over time and allowing them to feel that anxious feeling is something that can be safe given the right circumstances. But if it seems like it's something where the person is going to need some real therapy, make sure you reach out and get some help for that. And then the final thing that you can do to help someone with anxiety is to prompt them, Let me repeat that. Prompt them to identify other outcomes that may happen contrary to what their initial thought is. So I didn't check the lock. That means the house is going to get broken into and everything I own is going to be stolen or destroyed. Well, okay, that is one choice. That may happen. But then you can ask them, what else might happen if the lock isn't checked? And they could say, well, Stark could get kidnapped. Stark could get taken. You're right. You know what? That's another thing that could happen. What's something else that could happen? Well, there could be somebody who's hiding in the house when we come back in. You know what? You're right. That is something that could happen. What's something else that could happen? Well, maybe nothing. Maybe nothing will happen. You're right. Maybe nothing will happen. That's another thing that could happen. What you don't want to do is offer the person all sorts of alternative scenarios that they haven't come up with. If you do that, they will always revert back to the scenario that they've played out in their mind. But if you ask them, if you acknowledge, you know what, you are right. If we don't check the lock on the door, the house could get broken into, everything is stolen, and there's someone there waiting for us when we get home. That is complete. You are right. That could happen. Then that normalizes that emotion. But if you allow them to then say, like, well, maybe that also won't happen. Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe the door is locked. Maybe without checking the lock at all, maybe the door is locked. Then that can help them to identify alternative scenarios and not hyper focus on the one that their brain has settled on. So you want to normalize the emotion, expose them over time to that thing if that's safe to do. And again, you can prompt them to identify other outcomes. And always, 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 if you feel that someone is facing an anxiety disorder, you can reach out and get them some therapy, get them some help. Let's talk about just a few more resources if you're wanting to support especially an anxious child. One resource that I will always recommend is what's called The Whole Brain Child by Dr. Dan Siegel. It's a book. It's very well written, very easily written. And if you are supporting an anxious child, or if you are just helping raise a child in any way, it is a fantastic book to check out. There's also another thing. If you head to MisterStuTV.com, that's MisterStuTV.com, and click on resources, there is what we've called the home check-in sheet. Now that would be for a parent at home. There's also a school check-in sheet. If you are a teacher or a caregiver in a school environment, then you can use those sheets to talk with the child about different feelings that they may be feeling. And if you can normalize those feelings of fear and anxiety and even anger, sadness, different things like that, it can greatly decrease emotional distress that a child may be feeling. So head over to MisterStuTV.com. That's MisterStuTV.com. Click on resources and you'll see that resource there. Finally, I want to tell you that the first episode of Mr. Stu TV, the full-length episode, will be out in January of 2023, and our first episode deals with anxiety, what anxiety is, what it feels like, and what to do about it. So make sure you're on the lookout. Make sure you follow Mr. Stu TV everywhere. That's MisterStuTV. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Follow us everywhere that you can, and you will get that information about our first episode coming out in January 2023 about anxiety. We've had many episodes, many episodes come out before. This will be our first full-length episode, and it deals entirely with anxiety, especially as it relates to children. It'll be a fun one for you and the children in your life to watch together. That is it in a nutshell. Anxiety, facts versus myths. I hope that this was helpful to you. I hope that you feel supported and that you feel confident to know a little bit more about anxiety now than maybe you did before we started. Make sure you're back again next month. It will be on December 11th. On December 11th, live at 5 with Mr. Stu on Facebook and Instagram. We'll be talking about raising resilient kids, different ways to promote resiliency in children, and it'll be a lot of fun. So I hope to see you back on December 11th at 5 p.m. Until then, thank you so much for checking us out. Make sure to follow MisterStuTV everywhere, and make sure to check out MisterStuTV.com. That's MisterStuTV.com. And until next time, spread the word and share the love. Peace.